Good afternoon, everyone. We are so glad that you have chose to join us today for our live chat. My name is Lakeland Hogan. I'm gerontologist and caregiver advocate with Home Instead Senior Care. And again, want to thank you so much for tuning in with us. We're going to give you all a few minutes to get logged in, get settled wherever you are, at home or at work. Because we have a really great topic today that I'm excited about, and that's faith's role in the caregiving journey. And just to give you some background, our live chats are brought to you by Home Instead Senior Care, a network of locally owned franchise offices. The Home Instead Senior Care Network offers in-home care with an individualized approach to help keeping your loved one safe and independent at home. And to learn more, you can visit homeinstead.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. If you're just joining us, we are doing our monthly live chat. This month, we're focusing on faith's role in the caregiving journey. And before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items that I want to go over briefly. First of all, we're muting all of your lines. That's to reduce background noise, and we want you to be able to still move about the house. If the doorbell rings, the dog barks, no worries on our end. We can't hear you. So all lines have been muted. And we also want to hear from you. That's the whole point of these live chats, is to take your questions in real time. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Open that up and feel free to type in a question. There's no such thing as a silly question. In our caregiving community, it's really questions from one another that are really important to the learning that goes on in these chats. We learn from everyone's situations, and so your question will be helpful to someone else. So please don't be shy. Ask those questions at any time. And you can send your question anonymously. You'll see an option before you click send to do so. And then we are recording today's webinar, so you don't have to worry about taking notes. We will record it, and then we will email it back out to you within the next 24 hours to the email address you registered with. We also post it on our website, helpforalzheimersfamilies.com, so you can always refer back to it there. But the great thing about the recorded webinars, or you can forward them along to a family member or friend, fellow caregiver that wasn't able to join us, or if you really like the portion of it and want to listen again, you can certainly do so. So that covers all of our housekeeping items for today. So I think we'll go ahead and get started on our topic. So on these caregiving chats, we talk a lot about the challenges of the caregiving journey. It can be full of emotional highs and lows. It can also be physically and mentally draining at times. And it can be hard to cope with those various emotions and cope with the challenges of managing a caregiving role, whether you're solely a caregiver or you're also in that sandwich generation of caring for your children and your aging parents. Maybe you're also working and caregiving, so there's a lot going on. And it's really important for family caregivers to find an outlet for the stresses and the emotions of caregiving. It's important to figure out what works best for you to draw strength from, to find renewal and motivation to keep going in your caregiving journey. And for many people, faith is that outlet. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on faith's role in the caregiving journey. And we're very excited to have an expert on this topic with us today to talk about how faith can be incorporated throughout that caregiving journey. So our guest expert is Rick Hamlin. He's the executive editor of Guideposts, where he's worked for over 30 years. He is an author of numerous books exploring the power of prayer and faith. His book, 10 Prayers You Can't Live Without, was published in 2013 and discusses how you can talk with God about anything. His memoir, Finding God on the Train, was Book of the Month Club alternate selection, and he's also published Reading Between the Lines and Pray for Me. Additionally, he recently published 2 op-eds in the New York Times. And he and his wife, Carol, live in New York City and both sing in their church choir. So we are so honored to have Rick Hamlin with us. Welcome, Rick. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's so nice to be here. When you say expert on faith, I sort of think, oh my gosh, really? But really, the role here at Guideposts is, for me, is telling and helping people tell their faith stories. And in the past few years, we've run a lot of caregiving stories from caregivers. And my job as an editor is to hear what the story is and help them say that story in a way that can be as helpful as possible for all of our readers. As you can imagine, it's a pretty great job to be able to hear people's stories and help them tell them to others.
That does sound like a great job.
Yeah, I mean, and when you think about caregiving, I suppose the one personal anecdote, and I think this really does touch on prayer, because prayer is so important to caregivers. I remember my mom, who was a fabulous caregiver for my father in his last few years. And one Sunday morning, and boy, you can picture this, she drove him to church. She got out the walker from the trunk of the car. He's walking behind, and she's just barreling forward. And as she says, I just pray, and I pray for patience. And Dad was heard to mutter, well, there's a prayer that hasn't been answered yet.
Oh, I love that story. That is great. I think it's also important to recognize that we can still find humor in caregiving and even in references to faith at times. I love that story. Thank you so much for sharing that, Rick, and for, again, sharing your experience, your wisdom when it comes to this topic today. I'm really excited to kind of dive in and explore it a little further. And I know you've mentioned a little bit about your role at Guideposts, but for those that don't know what Guidepost is, would you mind just giving us a couple minutes explanation on, or a couple seconds, however long it takes, I guess, just a blurb about Guideposts so that we're all on the same page and know about what Guidepost is?
A Guidepost is a magazine of inspirational stories. They're all first-person stories told from the point of view of the person who's gone through the experience. I love one of our goals as a resource is to help people love more and hate less, to help the world and transform the world that way. But it's really it's real people's stories, people who are in the trenches of life, and discover how faith does make a difference to them. And they tell that personal story so that others can know the same. We've been around for almost 75 years, founded by Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. And we are all in our ways positive thinkers. And the power of prayer, I think, is just shimmers through every story.
Thank you so much for giving us that background. And, Homestead and Guideposts have been partners for many years. We've done some advertising in your magazines and really find this, and we've had some of our employees have their personal stories shared in Guideposts. And I always find the stories to be inspirational. Some of them are happy, some of them are sad, but there's always an inspiration, a lesson that can be taken, and the power of prayer is so evident in so many of those stories. And I'm hoping that you would be willing to share some of the caregiving related stories with us today. I know that Guidepost recognizes many stories about family caregivers, or that have an aspect of caregiving to them. So it would be great if you could share a few of those stories, because I think we learn so much through storytelling, and as you guys do it so well, the power of a story can really kind of have a ripple effect. So I'll stop talking now and let you share a few stories.
Yeah, I learn a lot through stories. When I hear people's stories, I learn, wow, that helps me. I mean, I when I come to work and I might be in a grumpy mood, but just after I'm here for half an hour, I feel charged. I think there's some images here too that we can share of some of the storytellers, so you can see their faces at least. Carlin Maddox, for instance, he had an amazing story. His wife, at age 50, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And wow, what a dreadful and more importantly, scary, a frightening experience for him. I mean, he was just riddled with fear. One of the first things he and his wife did is they went on a retreat. They went to see a nun who had been recommended by their minister. Neither he nor his wife were Catholic, but they went on this retreat, and the sister gave them some really good advice. She said, your main calling at this time is to trust that you belong to God and not to yourself. And trust. Now, there's a challenge when you're dealing with fear, to trust God. So Carlin's whole journey as a caregiver, as he watched his incredibly talented, independent, strong-willed wife go through this journey, losing so much cognition and so many of her gifts. And every time he would face this fear, he tried to figure out a way to pray his way out of it. He worked with and was very much helped by a minister in Australia who recommended, I think this is an interesting thing, I don't know if you've ever tried it before, but said to actually turn your face physically away from the fear. When the fearful thought came, to turn physically away, like 180 degrees. He said he would do it at his desk so often that he almost got dizzy. I'm getting dizzy just trying it myself. But, sometimes we do those, a physical thing to address what is an emotional thing. In the end, he went on a journey to meet this Australian minister face to face. He took a trip. His children took care of his wife, and there were some other professional caregivers. And he was at his wit's end. He just talked to this guy, and he said, I don't know what to do, this fear. And the minister said, you're focusing too much on the problem. You've got to let go. And so in a course of several days through prayer, he suddenly had this incredible vision. And this is an amazing thing, of God's tent. There was this tent just covering him and his wife and his family, and feeling that shelter. He held on to it, and when he went back home, he found that it was less difficult to do some of those chores with his wife, because whatever it was, that feeling of God's presence was there, and that getting her dressed in the morning, which sometimes could be a source of struggle, somehow his confidence and trust, she could share, she could feel, even though the words weren't shared. She lived at home, stayed at home for another 6 years. She did end up going to a care facility. He would visit her every day, even though she could no longer recognize him. And people said, why? And he said, because she's my wife. She's someone I love. And even at the end, he felt that tent over them, sheltering them.
Wow, that's such an inspirational story. And as you were talking through the emotions that Mr. Maddox was facing, those are some of the emotions that many of our caregivers that listen to these chats express to us. The fear of the unknown of the disease, the overwhelming feeling of having to take on that caregiving role. And so Mr. Maddox has a great example of how he drew on his faith and found strength. And I think what's so neat that you mentioned about his wife is that he felt as if his wife could feel that sense of peace and that sense of shelter that his faith provided. And so often I think that caregivers forget that even if our loved ones can't verbally express anymore their feelings and what's happening, they can still sense our sense of peace or calm. And so that's, I think, important for family caregivers to keep in mind is caregivers need to draw on that sense of strength because it will translate to their loved one as well. We don't want them to forget about that. But thank you so much for sharing this story. It's definitely one that hopefully our caregivers can find themselves relating to. Do you have another story that you would want to share with us?
Well, if you ask, I guess so. Sure. Sure. Let's look at another picture here. Here we see Luann Becker and her husband Bob, and they too were a dynamic couple. They actually made some documentary films together. Bob was a radio host. He did the lottery drawing every month, and so they were a confident couple. Well, when he got a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and as you know, it can be very hard to diagnose, and sometimes those symptoms show quite early before anybody's willing to be brave enough to ask a doctor. But they did see a doctor, and she just sank into a terrible depression. She just didn't want to get up out of bed, and it was so unlike her and so unlike their relationship, and she was also afraid to share this with anybody. She was afraid that he still had his job and that he would be fired, and she was afraid to talk to anyone. She was told to talk to someone from the Alzheimer's Association, and she did manage to make that phone call. And the woman said, we have a support group. And Luann thought, oh, the last thing I want to do is sit around and talk to other people who have to go through this terrible thing that I am going through. That sounds so depressing. But she kept on resisting getting help, and that's also something we know a lot about in faith. It's we have to open ourselves up for help. I mean, God has lots of helpers out there who want to help us, and sometimes we can't say, oh yeah, and so she resisted that for a long time. Finally, she said, okay, we'll just go to that support group. We'll just go once. And it was such a relief to her. I mean, once again, there was humor. In this support group, it was the men who all were suffering Alzheimer's, and the caregivers were all the wives. And she looked around, and one guy said, I thought, well, this might be the time I should write that novel, because I'm not going to have another chance. And they were at least aware enough they could laugh at that. And then she had this community. We can't do faith by ourselves. We need each other. And that was such a gift to her, that this challenge she was facing, there were other people who could share it with her. What a gift. And that was God's gift to her. And it renewed their relationship. They were sort of almost like young marrieds again. They went to the zoo, and she said we were like kids. We could sort of just enjoy each other as we were. Elizabeth Sherrill, who's a longtime writer for Guideposts, once said so wisely, the one prayer God can't answer is, don't change a thing. Change is what happens, and she didn't want anything to change. But when we accept change, and God only knows, one of my biggest and hardest prayers was one of acceptance, but she was able to accept, and it made such a difference for her as a caregiver, and for her to enjoy her husband in these years as she has. What a transformation.
Wow, there's so many good lessons that you can draw from this couple's story. I know that it sounds like she was so resistant to finding support, and there are some caregivers who are very open and accepting, but there are some that have similar struggles where they're just closed off to the idea of support. But it can be so helpful and part of the healing and the acceptance and the understanding that, one, you're not alone. You're not the only one that's going through these struggles, and there's so much that can be learned from one another. And then I loved how you talked about how she was finally able to accept change. And we know with Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, it's a progressive disease. So change of the loved one is inevitable. But it sounds like this couple really was able to find joy at the various stages of the disease, and to make kind of the most of it, if you will. And I think sometimes it's easy as a caregiver to get so caught up in the day-to-day and be so overwhelmed by a diagnosis that it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that we need to make the most of of every day with our loved one, and kind of find ways to find the joy. So I really like that story, and I like the title, A New Way to Love. I think that that's kind of a mind shift that sometimes is hard for family caregivers to accept at times. Is love might look a little different, or the relationship might be a little different, whether it's a husband or wife, or a mother-daughter or mother-son, father-son caregiving situation. It'll change, but that love can still certainly be present. So thanks for sharing that one. I really liked that story. And we have some time for a few others if you have some additional ones to share.
Sure. This is Jeff Bajork. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But Jeff is a psychologist and a teacher out at Fuller Seminary in California, and he had a mother that he adored, and she was a bright, talented artist. And then to watch her, once again, Alzheimer's came to her, and he has this epiphany, which I find so startling. He saw this as valuable in her spiritual journey, that as she was losing memory and losing track of things, he saw it was as though she was making room for the spiritual, making room for God. She had a wonderful sunny temperament, and was always able to look for the things to be grateful for. It was a habit that she had before she got Alzheimer's, and it was a habit that she was still able to hold on to. But they used to share worship in church, and she got to a point where being in a congregation, it really agitated her, and she couldn't do it anymore. Well, Jeff brought church to her, first in her home, and then she was in a care facility. He would bring the church activities, and they would do a little church together. He would sing a hymn with her. And once again, singing, I adore singing, and singing can bring a lot of communication for people who can't do verbal communication, but somehow singing can communicate to them. And he would sing some old musical comedy songs. He would sing the old one, I love you, a bushel and a peck, and she would sing, and a hug around the neck. So it was a change in the relationship, but I'm startled by that revelation of his, that he saw it as preparation for the journey that she was going on, and that she was able to do that because there would be these moments of luminous attention and vivid awareness, and he was with her to the end. There she was on that journey.
That's such a great story, and I think I know from my gerontology studies that the part of the brain that seems to be kept most intact is the one that is connected to song and to singing and music, and so I think that that's so beautiful that Jeff was able to bring kind of church to his mom even when she wasn't able to physically get to a service, and also as a way to help her stay spiritually connected, because I know we're talking about how faith can help a caregiver along their journey, but we also need to remember that the individual who's going through the various stages of dementia, that's if it was important to them before they developed Alzheimer's disease, it's likely going to be something that they want to continue to engage with, and those kind of meaningful activities of singing together and reading the Bible, and they can be ways for them to engage and a neat activity that they can share with their loved one who has Alzheimer's. You mentioned how Jeff's mom would start the song and she would finish singing it. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Alive Inside. Have you seen that movie? They bring iPods into nursing homes, and they find out what kind of music the individual liked to listen to when they were younger or whatnot, and put together a customized playlist. And then you know, for these individuals who had dementia, who were really not verbally engaging at all, they would put these headphones on and they would hear the music, and many of which was gospel music. And there's one gentleman that sticks out in my mind. They hadn't heard him really utter a word in months. And the minute he heard one of his favorite gospel songs, he perked up, and the staff was just amazed. If you have a chance to see it, it's a wonderful film. Alive Inside is the name of it. But the power of music. And then once he got to singing the words, they started asking him questions, and he was responding, whereas he before hardly spoke a word. So there's so much power in music that I don't think that we give it enough credit for. I mean, I even think back to when I was a student, I would get so frustrated I couldn't remember, you know, any of my history lessons, but I could remember every word to every Backstreet Boys song. You know, it's just, there's a different part of our brain that holds on to the music, and for many people, those gospel hymns can be ones that stick with for years and years, and even through the disease. So
yeah, I mean, I think I could only say the ABCs if I sing my way through it. I mean, you know, and I confess the only Bible verses I really can remember are ones that I, you know, can sing along with. So, but I discovered that too when my father in his last months was in a care facility, and I would sing to him, and I think we should remember that it in the Bible it says make a noise. It doesn't say we have to be perfect singers. That the joyful noise is what we can always communicate.
Yes, I love that. And well, and actually Becky, who's listening, she just wrote in and said that she's a board certified music therapist. And she says that music is a gift, that it activates the entire brain. When combined with an emotional event, it becomes more powerful. And she says, yes, the movie Alive Inside, Henry is the name of the character in the movie that I was referring to, the gentleman who really came alive. So Becky, thanks for adding that. And thanks for what you do as a music therapist. I know that can be so powerful, not only for the individual living with Alzheimer's, or I know music therapy at end of life can be so powerful, but can also be powerful for the family members too. And so Becky, thank you for writing in. And if anyone else has questions out there, we'll kind of weave them in. I know we wanted to share a couple more stories, but we can weave the questions in as we go. So please feel free to send us in your questions. I know we do have one question, Rick, I guess before you start into this next story, someone's asking, you know, where can we read these stories that are being shared, and how can we go about sharing our own stories? And I know we're going to share the Guideposts website towards the end, but Rick, do you want to address that question before we jump into the next story?
We'll address it at the end, and we'll address it now. Certainly you can go to our website, guideposts.org. We have a special caregiving, you know, a panel. I mean, you just push that button and you can go right to caregiving stories. So not only do we have wonderful caregiving stories, we've got practical tips and advice and resources for getting help, and you know, there's a whole special section also on Alzheimer's and dementia, because we know that's an issue for so many people. We also have a devotional for caregivers, and you can see some of those individual devotionals for caregivers. And God only knows, when you're caregiving, it's hard to find time for yourself. But just to take a moment and to read just a page can be a blessing. So if that's what you need, just one devotional a day to stay connected to your faith as you carry out so many of your duties.
That's great. I'm glad that you brought up the devotion, and thank you for sharing that, Rick. And at the end, again, we'll touch on the website again, and we'll kind of show you a screenshot of exactly where you can go on the site to find those caregiving stories. But we want to thank you for that question. And again, we're going to let Rick share this next story about Alice, but please type in your questions if you have any about faith and caregiving, any question. There's no such thing as a silly question in this. You're in a safe space with us here amongst other caregivers and people who want to support you in your caregiving journey. So please feel free to type in those questions anytime in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So, all right, Rick, would you mind telling us about Alice? I love that picture, that beautiful sunset. it's a striking photo. So I'd love to hear more about her story.
Well, sunsets and sunrises are very much part of Alice's story. Actually, I first met Alice on Facebook and on social media, and I'm sort of bearing the lead here because social media was partly something that did help her. Her husband had heart surgery, open heart surgery at age 81. He'd been dynamic. He'd worked almost up till then. And suddenly she was cast in the role of caregiver. He had to go back and get additional surgery. And she's somebody who said she knew herself long enough to say, I'm not going to be a good caregiver. I'm just not cut out for this. She learned, but one of the things she learned is she had to make sure she made time in her day for herself. And one of the things that she did was to take a picture of the sunrise or the sunset and post it on Facebook. When her husband came home and he was doing better, but when he'd wake up, he'd need stuff early in the morning, and she made a deal with him. And I love this. This strikes me as being such an honest, wonderful marriage. She said, I will not help you until 7:30 in the morning. She left the pills. Everything was there for him. She said, unless it's really an emergency, I need time on my own until 7:30 in the morning. And that worked and does work for them. But this other part of herself, this love of nature, she was able to indulge by just seeing the sunrise and seeing the sunset and then posting those images on social media. Once again, that's where a place that she could share. She could share her fears, and people engaged. I mean, social media gets so much negative talk, but what a gift it can be if you're feeling really lonely and as a caregiver. She discovered lots of people who could sympathize, and also, when she had a funny story, she could share that. But one sunrise and one sunset after another. What a calling. She's always made sure she had time for herself.
I love that story. And I didn't even know that the sunrise and sunset were part of her story before I mentioned how beautiful that photo was. But I think that you're so right, Rick. Social media can be an outlet, and also taking time for yourself as a caregiver is so important. And it's easier said than done for a lot of people. Even in our everyday lives, it can be hard to find some time for ourselves. But I like how she kind of, almost marked in her calendar every morning she wanted that time to herself and really stuck to it, unless, of course, her husband needed her in an emergency. But sometimes as caregivers, we put ourselves on the back burner and we don't give ourselves the love and attention that we deserve, or don't do a little self-love. That's kind of the last thing on our to-do list. And so I love her story and the social media part of it. I know we have a social media presence, Remember for Alzheimer's, that is so active. We have so many people engaging. We'll put out a question about stressful situations that they're dealing with, and people write in and give each other tips. And so for those that maybe can't make it to a support group, like you shared in one of the other stories, that social media can be a great outlet. And even just expressing maybe a prayer concern, or I know that there's also a lot of technology can be a way that we can tap into faith. I know that I have a podcast I listen to every morning. It's a devotional podcast. I know there's apps out there with, different devotions and Bible apps where you can look up verses. And I know Guideposts has a lot of great online resources. So as caregivers, it's so important to really just, find what works for you, but being intentional about taking that time for you, because we know caregivers' time is so precious. But even just a few minutes to capture the sunrise or capture the sunset can be so meaningful, and a chance to renew a little bit every single day. So I love that story. Thanks so much for sharing.
You're welcome. One thing we've done at Guideposts almost since the founding was pray for others. And as you know, praying for others can be so valuable for yourself in your own spiritual growth. And yeah, any readers, anybody listening to this, you can always post a prayer at ourprayer.org. And people get on and they pray for those requests. You can see people praying for those requests. So that sharing of prayers, wherever two or more are gathered. And now we do it, through cyberspace. Two or more are gathered, as you and I are separated by hundreds of miles, but we certainly are gathered here through cyberspace.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, Rick, you might have one more story to share with us before we move on to some questions. But I'm hoping there's a story behind the quilt in this photo, because that looks like such a unique and beautiful quilt. So I would love to hear a little more about this story.
Yeah, it's a memory quilt, which is a lovely thing to do. This story from Christy Dewberry is interesting because you see her with her mother and they look so close, but it wasn't that way. She and her mother did not get along. At this point, at the end, they did, but initially, for many years, they did not. And sometimes the caregiving role can offer these unexpected gifts. Christy was called in as a caregiver actually because of her father. Her father developed pancreatic cancer, which, as you know, is really devastating. Amazingly enough, he lived for another 5, almost 6 years. And Christy spent, because she was the closest one in her siblings, spent a lot of time taking care of her father. And because of that, she had to spend more time with her mother. And her mother had some early signs of dementia and paranoia, and it was really difficult, but she didn't want to let her father down. So year after year, day after day, spending that time, sometimes spending overnight time with her father, she got closer to her mother. And she was there at the very end when her father died. Her mother had stepped out of the room. And her mother became her friend. Her mother did slip further into dementia and had to go to a care facility, but she grew warmer and affectionate. And at the care facility there, her mother was one of the most popular ones there. And the caregivers said, "Oh, we love your mother. What a wonderful woman she is. What a wonderful relationship you must have had." And Christy had to admit, she didn't admit it out loud, but to herself, that relationship wouldn't have really evolved if she hadn't been that caregiving role with her father. So we think, oh, well, caregiving, it's so hard, but it can offer these unexpected gifts. This is actually in our April issue of Guideposts, which you can get online, and we're offering free copies of the April issue. There's a whole special loving care section about caregiving in this issue. So I hope as many of you are listening will go online and get a free copy of this whole issue. You can read this story and so many others. But caregiving, it offers these surprises.
That is so true. I think that, well, I've talked to so many family caregivers about how their caregiver journey has changed them. And so many of them say, it's changed them for the good. And that good looks different for everyone. And it sounds like here it really strengthened the relationship she had with her mother. And I've heard that of couples who, there was a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and everything kind of finally made sense. The reasons why the spouse was acting the way they were, there was now a reason for it, and it actually was better for their marriage. It was a blessing that there was a diagnosis, because otherwise they were kind of at their wits' end with one another, but now they had a better understanding and could work together. And I know that's not always the case for every caregiving situation, but there is a lot of good that can come from the various caregiving responsibilities and the relationships that are formed. And I think that maybe on the next slide we'll have the website where you can download a copy of the April edition, and if not, we'll make sure to share it, but we'll share it towards the end. But
Yeah.
I thank you for that story as well, because I do think that while you're sometimes in the throes of caregiving and don't always realize, how it's impacting you and changing you, but a lot of times people, once they're kind of through the caregiving journey, they have time to reflect on the various ways that it has impacted their life and their relationship with others. So I really like that story as well. So many good stories, Rick. We could probably talk for 4 hours about all of the different stories that we have, but I do want to get to some questions because we have had a few come in. So, Rick, if it's okay with you, I'm going to jump into a couple questions here.
Great.
All right. So our first question comes from Liam, and Liam, he says that his wife was diagnosed about 4 years ago with MCI, or Alzheimer's, which turned into Alzheimer's disease. And so over time, due to caregiving, he's sustained a couple injuries himself, and he is Lutheran by faith and used to be an usher at his church. And because of his caregiving role and some of his physical limitations, he's no longer able to get to church. And so the question for Liam is, how can he still engage in his faith community, even though he might not be able to physically be there? Rick, do you have any suggestions for Liam?
Well, I hope church can come to him. Sometimes we're afraid to acknowledge that we would love to have church or come to us when we can't get there. One of the things I do for my church is I do take communion to some of our homebound members, and it's a gift for me. I adore doing it. It reminds me of that line from Jesus about the least of these. I mean, that's how we find Jesus, is being with the sick and the homebound. So I hope that he's not ashamed or intimidated to ask if anybody can bring church to him. There's often so many resources, people who want to do that. But we've also seen, through social media, that there are faith communities. I think Guideposts, Our Prayer, is a certain faith community, being able to pray for others and to ask for prayers for yourself. And we heard also in one of those stories about the son who visited his mom and tried to bring a little bit of church to her.
Yeah, those are some great suggestions, Rick. I think that, we've talked about this earlier, sometimes it's hard for caregivers to ask for help or to ask for various things that they need, but it sounds like for Liam, he would benefit from having members of his church visiting and sharing with him. And I know a lot of faith communities now record their sermons or their messages, and they put them out in various forms, whether it's a YouTube video or a podcast, or perhaps even Liam's church, when they record it, they could make him a copy of the CD and bring it to him. So I think you're so right, Rick. You just have to reach out and see if what the faith community is willing to do to help them still stay engaged. So Liam, we hope that is helpful in answering your question. And thank you so much for writing in. And if you're thinking of a question out there, you haven't asked it yet, we hope that you will. There's a Q&A box, or you can type it into the chat box here on the Zoom platform that we're using the technology for this chat. So we do have a question from Julia. She says, how can you share your faith with a parent who has Alzheimer's and is uncomfortable talking about God? Any suggestions for her, Rick? I know that can be challenging. And I it's kind of, you could ask it more as a general question. How do you go about, sharing your faith with others? And it sounds like in Julia's situation, her parents are a little uncomfortable discussing it.
Yeah, I think, we all can preach many sermons just by what we do. And I think by being a caregiver, you're certainly sharing your faith, because you're showing God in action. That can speak so much louder in some ways than words. But I think, the singing of hymns, just, sometimes people don't want to hear words, but sometimes sharing a song, sharing a hymn, one of those old gospel songs, sometimes that can be a way of sharing faith without being preachy, without using so much, as we'd say, words. But yeah, and as we, in this case, it's particularly difficult because the parent has Alzheimer's. But as we talked about, that music can reach somebody where the cognition is a struggle. But I suspect she's sharing her faith already in ways that she doesn't even know.
I think you're probably right, Rick. I know that many of our caregivers that work for us professionally at Home Instead talk about how, they feel like they're caregiving, they're able to express their faith through their actions and through caring and loving. And so I know, Julia, you might not always, see it, but I think that you likely are like our professional caregivers in that you kind of live out your faith through your actions, like Rick had mentioned. And so I think that those are some really great suggestions, Rick, that you offered up. And Julia, we hope that is helpful to you in answering your question. And we do have another question, or maybe more so someone just kind of sharing her story. Sashay says that her mother is 81 on dialysis and has dementia. She says we put her in an assisted living where she is active, but sounds like this caregiver herself has been in a deep depression ever since. She says, though I know they're doing a great job, I cannot care for her like she needs. I'm fighting depression with faith. Every day is a challenge. So thank you so much for sharing your story, Sashay. And I hope that I'm saying your name correctly. It's spelled beautifully, but you're not alone in your emotions of caregiving. We work a lot with family caregivers who talk about, how emotionally challenging it can be to move a loved one to a care facility, or when your loved one needs a level of care beyond what you can provide. It's hard, and so. We're glad that you're joining us today and sharing your story. Rick, do you have any words of inspiration or encouragement for Sashay as she's listening to this chat today?
Yeah, I think, that sense of loss, because it's losing someone sort of little by little, and feeling that. I mean, it is grief, and it sounds also there's a sense losing her sense of purpose, because the caregivers in the facility are doing it, but there is so much purpose that she can bring just by visits. I also think of something my mother said when my father died, and it was really lovely. She said, he gave us the luxury of being able to say goodbye. And I think we touched on it with Jeff and his mother, and that slow decline, and the pain of it from one side. But on the other side, this is a beautiful thing, and can be a beautiful thing to have this time at the end of enjoying someone even with their diminished capacities.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rick. And Sashay says exactly, thank you so much. So we appreciate you joining us today and for sharing your story. And someone else just wrote in with their story. We're getting a flood of questions and stories shared, which is the whole point of these chats, which makes my heart so happy. So Debbie shared her story with us. She says that her mom was diagnosed about 8 years ago. She has lived with her for 6 years and now is in a care facility. They used to go to church together. Her mom loves gospel music, which they do sing together. She's asking, how can I approach my mom about faith and looking forward to heaven? She's 89 years strong and in a moment of clarity has told her that she wants to go to heaven. How can I help in communicating possibly fears? So she says, thank you for your advice. So sounds like her mom has communicated that she wants to go to heaven, but Debbie's wondering, how can I talk to her about it and maybe address some of her fears about passing away, which is, I think, something that's so common. there's a lot of unknowns at the end of life, but I think faith is where a lot of people draw their strength, and many people believe that there is life after death, and so that can be really comforting. So, Rick, any words for Debbie and her situation with her mom?
Well, again, I think of something that a prayer that I make for my mother, who is 92 years old and strong, going strong, but does live at home with a caregiver who comes in 5-6 days a week. But the prayer I told my mom I make for her is I pray for a direct flight. Because, you know, at this point, as she says, I'm not afraid of death, she says, but I'm afraid of dying. And, you know, there are so many medical wonders that prolong life, but one wants to know that at the end, it is a direct flight. So I don't know if an old friend of mine gave me those words, a direct flight. She prayed for direct flight, and it's a prayer that we can only trust what is on the other side. But from here, those of us here on Earth, just that prayer, a direct flight.
I like that. I think that that's such a great metaphor, if you will. And I recently took a hospice course where we talked a lot about end of life, and people do use a lot of those metaphors of, you know, a direct flight or on the train or something like that. So I think, Debbie, we hope that that is helpful to you, and if you're able to have those discussions with her, reassuring her that through her faith, she'll know where she's going, and so we thank you first for sharing your story and hope that you find that helpful. And then one last comment before we go to our resource slide. Gail wrote in and she asked if we're aware of memory cafes. Rick, have you heard of memory cafes?
No, tell me about a memory cafe.
Well, I've unfortunately never been to one. We don't have any in our community that I'm aware of. But I know in many communities, these memory cafes, and hopefully, Gail, I'm explaining this correctly, but they're maybe a coffee shop or a restaurant where people gather regularly. It's kind of like a support group, I believe. And it's people maybe that are living with the disease and those that are caregivers. And it's just a kind of a safe space for them to all gather and to share stories and experiences. I hope I'm getting this right. That's my impression of them. And so hopefully, if you live in a community with a memory cafe and you're a caregiver, or if you have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you should look into them. They're a really neat concept, and it can be a great sense of support and community, in addition to all these other great things that we've talked about today. So, Gail, thank you so much for writing in with that comment. I do want to make sure we get to tell you all about the Guidepost website. So, Rick, we have a screenshot up of the website. Would you mind just giving us a little insight on where they can find these awesome stories?
Well, if you just go to guideposts.org and you can find our website, and you see that little arrow is pointing to caregiving. And when you click onto it, you're going to see so much in the way of resources and tremendous stories. So when you have the chance, go ahead and click on and join us and get some of the stories and avail yourself of the resources.
Wonderful, thank you. So yeah, please go and check out the Guidepost website. And we have a few other resources that we wanted to share with you. Rick, I'll let you explain this one as well.
Well, I had mentioned earlier that those of you who have prayer requests, we always, receive and have been praying for initially our readers, but now this whole community that's online. So here's a way you can send in your request, and others will pray for you. Those of us here at the office will pray for you. It's something that's just so helpful for all of us in our faith journey, to hear about other people's struggles, to open ourselves up to their issues, to sort of growing compassion with each other. And it's that faith community that meets online. Now we get millions of prayer requests, so please feel free to share a prayer request.
Thank you so much for letting us know about that prayer request form. And I agree. I think the power of prayer is so real, and it's something that can be so comforting as a caregiver, knowing that others are praying for you and praying with you as you go through this journey. So we hope that you go out there and submit a prayer request if you feel so called to do so. And then we talked earlier about downloading a free magazine. So it looks like we shortened up the link a little bit that would help you get to the free magazine for April's edition, which I believe that's the actual cover for April's edition. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's Chrissy Metz right there on the cover, who has an amazing story about her own journey when her mother was had a stroke, and her mother was a wonderful figure and is a wonderful figure in her life. So there's a bit of a caregiver element there. But yeah, please, you can get the whole magazine here, and many, many wonderful, inspiring stories.
Wonderful. And she's one of the stars of This Is Us, the TV show. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. That's it.
Yes. And I also saw on the cover there that edition of Guideposts also there was a mention of Alzheimer's on the cover. So we definitely know there's some good Alzheimer's stories in there as well. So thank you so much for making that available for people to download and read. Again, if you haven't read Guideposts before, the stories in there are wonderful. They're so well written and so heartfelt. So we hope that you will check that out. And again, the Guidepost website's at the very top of the resource slide here, guidepost.org. And then if you want to continue following our live chats, if you want additional resources, we have a website called helpforalzheimersfamilies.com. That is where we will post the recording of today's webinar. We also have a registration for upcoming live chats. We do these chats on a variety of topics, all centered around Alzheimer's and caregiving, so feel free to visit that site. We also have a Facebook group, so we talked a lot today about social media and a sense of community that you can find there. And the Facebook group is Remember for Alzheimer's. So go out there and like our page. We also post about live chats. We do some Facebook Live events too out there. So if you follow us, you'll get updates on that. We also there's a great book called Confidence to Care, and there's a corresponding website, and it's just great tips. There's a downloadable app for family caregivers, tips right at your fingers on your smartphone. So if your loved one is struggling maybe with bathing or agitation, you can type in those keywords, and then tips will pull up. And then for more general caregiving topics, caregiverstress.com is really relevant to all caregivers beyond just Alzheimer's and dementia family caregivers. You can check out that website. For in-home care and support, you can check out Home Instead's website, homeinstead.com. And of course, the Alzheimer's Association, they have great support groups. So if you're thinking, man, I would really like to join one of those, visit alz.org, and you can find some great resources there. And then there is also Us Against Alzheimer's is a larger group, but within there they have groups that are specific to networks of faith and to clergy. So if you're a member of clergy and want to help your faith community better support family caregivers that are have a loved one with Alzheimer's or dementia, you can visit their website. And then also there's a great organization called Dementia Friendly America, and you can become a dementia friend, or you can go through a little certification process. And you can also do that for your faith community. And so you can visit the Dementia Friendly website that's listed there at the bottom of the screen. And then real quick before we wrap things up, I did want to tell you about next month's chat. So I hope you will join us on April 30th of next month. We're going to be debunking some Alzheimer's aging in place myths. We're going to have a woman who specializes in assistive therapies and rehabilitation. So she's going to talk to us about ways we can help our loved ones age in place as they're experiencing changes that are the result of Alzheimer's disease or other aging issues. So we hope that you'll join us. Should be another great chat. And with that, I want to thank you, Rick, so much for joining us today on this live chat, for sharing the stories from your Guidepost magazine. I learned a lot from their stories, and I hope everyone that is listening also took away some great nuggets. Rick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I love Home Instead. Thanks a lot.
We love Guideposts. We really do. So we hope that you all will check out their website. With that, we'll let you all get back to your day. We thank you again for joining us and hope to see you in April. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.